Hello, everyone. It's nice to be with you. I'm Julia Pyper. I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and I'm host of the Political Climate Podcast. In this discussion, we're going to look at the outlook for U.S. climate and energy policy. As everyone listening will probably know, Democrats have won the presidency, held the House, and they've taken a narrow majority in the Senate. Climate advocates in Congress will now have more agency to implement more ambitious policies than previously anticipated. At the same time, though, across the aisle collaboration will be crucial as we look to future climate and energy legislation, particularly because of those key Senate votes that will be needed, again, to pass big legislation. Now, there are other pathways that we'll explore in this discussion. We have to also look to the presidency. President Biden has big climate goals and executive actions, including rejoining the Paris Agreement, which we'll discuss shortly. And so we'll also want to look at what the international engagement could be like for the United States going forward. So joining me to discuss all of this is Representative Kathy Castor, a Democrat from Florida. She's chair of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. Representative Castor has been part of the committee that unveiled the 500 plus page Climate Crisis Action Plan last summer, which was designed to give Congress a roadmap for solving the climate crisis. She's also been a longtime national leader on protecting the environment and finding climate solutions. We're also joined by Congressman David McKinley, a Republican of West Virginia. He's a senior member on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. He's one of two professional engineers in Congress, where he has been active on issues related to the coal industry, environmental regulation, energy efficiency, and healthcare. He also serves as vice chairman on the subcommittee on the environment. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Just as a quick reminder to our audience before we get going here, we will be taking questions throughout. Please enter those through the app that you are watching this session through. That's the best way to get us questions, and we'll be fielding those as we move along. So Chair Castor, I'd like to go to you first to sort of get a lay of the land in Washington, D.C. in light of all the political shifts. As I mentioned, Democrats have won a narrow majority in Congress, giving the party an opportunity to address climate and energy issues the way that they would like to. Although that narrow majority means that you'll have to get all Democrats on board, including possibly some Republicans. So what is your assessment of what the priorities will be now moving forward, given where the landscape is today?
Well, thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to be with you and everyone at the Atlantic Council and my colleague, Congressman McKinley. I enjoy serving with David. He is a very thoughtful member. Well, here we are one day before Joe Biden's inauguration, and there has been a lot of work over the past couple of years to craft a transportation and infrastructure package. And that's what I would look for in the early days of the new Congress as well, working with the Biden administration on the cleanest and greenest transportation and infrastructure package we have seen. I think if folks would go back to the bill that passed the House of Representatives last summer, the Moving Forward Act, there is a lot of policy in there that we will look to craft the modern transportation and infrastructure bill. We know we need to do this. Expand clean energy in America to help us with economic recovery, to create good paying jobs, to help make our communities back home more resilient. Clean energy holds so much promise for family sustaining jobs. We know we have to build the macro grid, the modern grid in America. We're rich with renewable resources like solar and wind, but a lot of them are in the Midwest, in the central part of the country. We've got to expand that, so we'll be focused on the modern grid. Also in transportation, it is a critical competitiveness issue for the United States of America that we continue to lead the world in automobiles, but also trucks, transit, rail, maritime, air. There is a lot of innovation that has to occur, and we think that if we continue to innovate here in America, we will be able to share those innovations across the world, but it will help workers and it will help companies here too. We also know we have a lot of work to do in conservation. Farmers are ready to tackle the climate crisis. We've also set a goal of conserving at least 30% of all of the natural lands and ocean areas by 2030. A lot of this work is bipartisan. In our, thank you for highlighting our report that my committee issued last summer. It contains a lot of bipartisan bills, and that's what we're going to focus on, building a bipartisan support for these clean energy solutions and help rebuild the economy.
Excellent. Thank you for that overview. And we're going to dig into all of that a little more, get a little more detail. But Representative McKinley, I'd like to bring you in on something Chair Castor mentioned about exporting technologies abroad and looking internationally on the role that the U.S. can play. And I want to go there because we are speaking at the Global Energy Forum. So later this year, nations will meet in Glasgow for COP26. We know that President-elect Joe Biden has pledged to re-enter the Paris Agreement. So what would you like to see come from those talks, and how would you like the U.S. to position itself in terms of energy and climate abroad?
Well, thank you for that question. And again, Kathy Castor, it's always good to see you. We've had a good working relationship on energy and commerce over the last number of years. So it's always an honor to be on the same panel with her in her role. And I want to thank the Atlantic Council for conducting this, holding this summit and this discussion so we can do it. Now, as to the global involvement, thank you for that. Because what we have to do, I think that's what the imperative for us and as Republicans in Congress, and I think the Democrats too, if they want to be responsible, is to look at the global aspects of this. Carbon capture, if we want to take care of the emissions, we have to go carbon capture. And what we're not seeing is around the world, other nations really adopting that program. Look at the remark that John Kerry said. I've got his quote. He said, if the United States or even all of the developed nations cut their CO2 emissions to zero, it would not offset the emissions coming from the rest of the world. We had a panel discussion in Energy and Commerce just a few months ago, and we asked them, if America decarbonized totally to zero, would we still have wildfires on the West Coast, droughts in the Midwest, and hurricanes? And the panel said yes, because the rest of the world is where the problem is. Gina McCarthy has said the same thing when she testified before us. She said American actions would not make a difference needed to address climate change. So it's not America, it's the rest of the world. And MIT put out their own report. MIT said that regardless of anything the United States does to decrease its emissions, until China and India reduce their emissions, the result will still be climate catastrophe. So this meeting in Glasgow, or all the meetings from Montreal, from Kyoto, on and on and on, the Paris, are all important that we energize, we get the rest of the world to buy in to their responsibility in climate change. And the first Paris Accord, quite frankly, was just political theater. If you look at the language, the big contributors to this were India and China. But yet the administration, the Obama administration, let them off the hook and said that, how's the quote goes, actually the language, it's in Article 4, Section 4 of the agreement says, developing nation parties should continue enhancing their mitigation efforts and are encouraged to move over time towards economy emission reductions. That's not shall, that's not must. And you were already seeing that here in China is already announcing in the Financial Times that they're going to increase their dependency on fossil fuels, particularly coal. So we've got to get them engaged. And so I'm going to challenge Casty and the rest of the committee. What we all have to do is make sure that we have a unified global approach towards this problem, because without it, we can decarbonize. And all we've done is just transform our economy here in the United States, and it won't benefit it. We're still going to have wildfires on the West Coast, droughts in the Midwest, and hurricanes on the East.
Chair Castor, do you have an initial response to that?
Well, I largely agree with Congressman McKinley. We have a lot of work to do internationally. Fortunately, tomorrow, President Biden, after he's sworn in, one of the first things he will do is say that America will return to its leadership role in the world and rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. We cannot expect other countries to meet their nationally determined commitments and targets unless we're part of it and we're walking the walk as well. So we will return to our leadership role. We will work with allies. I think there is an understanding across the globe that we have got to set new targets that are much more ambitious. They have to come with some enforcement mechanisms. That's a weakness that Congressman McKinley has identified. We know now that the Earth is warming to such an extent that those old Paris targets are not enough. If we're going to avoid significant exponentially rising costs and temperatures, emergency relief packages for wildfires, floods, hurricanes, we have got to get busy. China recently made an announcement that they intend to get to net zero by 2060. That is not good enough. And in their announcement, they did not identify much change at all in the first decade, in the next 10 years. That's not acceptable. So it's good that we'll have a knowledgeable diplomat in former Secretary of State John Kerry, who will be President Biden's right arm, right hand, going out across the globe so that we are ready in Glasgow, and we're working together with our allies and with other countries to avoid the worst impacts of climate.
Yeah, I take that point on the international goals being somewhat far out, but it's interesting covering this as a sort of clean energy business reporter, because we have seen targets set a tone and orient markets to then deploy capital in different ways. So even though these targets are far out, it's been interesting to see the private sector then mobilize and take advantage of those opportunities. I just recently was in India reporting on their emerging clean tech startup ecosystem, because it's about energy security and producing their own goods for their clean energy future at home. And so to that end, I'd like to ask Representative McKinley, you talked about carbon capture sequestration, and you talked about other types of mitigation. To what extent would you support a rapid scaling up of, say, renewables? That includes biofuels, hydropower, we could include nuclear, in addition to carbon capture sequestration? Really have that 1-2 punch, or do you really think that carbon capture is the only main focus to be had here?
I think carbon capture is the main focus. IEA came out with their own report saying the same thing, that says without carbon capture, our energy and climate goals will become impossible to reach. I don't know how much clearer we need to hear from that. So what we have to do is spend more time, more resources and innovation in dealing with carbon capture. The only one that we know that we have working right now is the Net Power facility down in LaPorte, Texas. It's a 50 megawatt facility down there. It's showing how we can capture our CO2, but we've got to go much further with that. And that means a lot more ambitious investments in carbon capture. 45Q is very instrumental in helping out on that. But what we've heard from the Biden transition team, they're only going to support 45Q until there's a carbon price. That's going to run into more division. And if we're trying to all come together to address this problem, I think we ought to acknowledge that carbon capture is going to be the key to it. And the sequestration through using 45Q is work. 21 of the 22 carbon capture demonstration projects all are a result of 45Q being put into place. So I'm hoping that we will continue to do that and not allow this approach that we're seeing from the Biden administration to roll back all the progress that was made in fossil fuels. Keeping in mind that we're only spending $800 million a year in the research into carbon capture with Nettle. That's the major facility doing that. We've got to significantly upgrade our investment. But in the last 2 years, we were not able to get the Democrats on the Appropriation Committee to allow us to get up to a higher number in fossil fuel research because of their goal. We're going to eliminate it anyway, they're saying. We're going to eliminate it anyway, so why are we spending money doing research into it? So it's going to make a very interesting discussion in the next couple of years how we deal with that.
Yeah, and I would like to bring in your legislation shortly to get a little more nuance. But let me ask you one more broader question, Representative McKinley. My understanding is the actual weight of carbon that you would need to capture, because you'd have to physically capture these particles, that would be incredibly massive to actually fully address our carbon problem. So would you support also accelerating other types of low carbon technologies at the same time, just to put a finer point on this?
Absolutely. And that is in our legislation that I'm working on with Kurt Schrader, a Democrat out of Oregon. Is it's not just all about fossil fuels, but it's also advancing nuclear. It's advancing wind and solar, some aspects of it. So our legislation called Innovate First, Regulate Later, I think is a complete 180-degree turn from what it was like under the Obama administration when they put regulations in effect that couldn't be met. And so therefore you had companies and groups all across America struggle and shut down their operations. We want to innovate first and addressing those problems. So I think now that I understand your question a little bit better, yes, that's what this legislation is trying to do. For 10 years, do a very deep dive into ways of reducing carbon. And it may be biological. It may be doing some other things that are non-traditional in that approach, such as using phytoplankton, advancing phytoplankton. I don't know. Whenever I mention it, I know most people their eyes glaze over because they don't understand that phytoplankton produces 50% of the CO2, absorbs the 50% of the CO2 in the atmosphere and produces oxygen. But yet it's one that we've ignored over the years. It's going to require some investment, some research into it, but I want to see us looking at phytoplankton. I like the tree approach. Al Gore's idea of when he published his book about the deforestation of the tropical rainforest. We've got to address those things as well. There are so many other aspects of what we can get into to reduce our CO2 emissions in the atmosphere.
So just for context, we're talking here about bipartisan legislation introduced by Representative McKinley that would invest in energy innovation program for carbon capture, sequestration, utilization, advanced nuclear, renewables, and storage, followed by a clean energy standard that would get the power sector to reduce emissions 80% by 2050. And sorry, Chair Castor, took a little bit of a detour there, but would love to bring in your views on how that aligns with what you're working on in your vision for the future.
Well, the linchpin is decarbonizing the power sector. And I think there may be some common ground building here with Representative McKinley's proposed legislation aiming for a clean energy standard. In our climate crisis action plan, we recommend that we establish a clean energy standard for the power sector and do so as quickly as possible. The scientists tell us we must reduce CO2 emissions to net zero no later than 2050, but we do not have time to waste. We've seen just over the past decade how temperatures have risen, the cost, the catastrophes it's driving. So the more that we front and load a lot of these research development investments, the more we press ahead to the clean energy transition, the better we're going to be in outer years. And hopefully those investments in R&D will help accelerate the type of innovations we need. In our climate crisis action plan, we do say that carbon capture is one tool in the toolbox, but we do not recommend deploying it unless there is a clear climate benefit. There are a lot of sectors in the economy like certain industrial processes, steel, fertilizer, where we don't have the answer yet on how to decarbonize those areas. So we need to invest there in R&D. And fortunately, in the year-end package passed by Congress, there were some bipartisan investments and agreements, including a lot of the energy efficiency legislation that Representative McKinley has worked on. So energy efficiency as well has to be a big part of this equation.
You mentioned a clean energy standard, and I'm super interested in that because we hear a lot about the drive to clean up the power grid and electrify everything. President-elect Joe Biden, soon to be President Joe Biden, has a goal of decarbonizing the power sector by 2035. There's obviously different views on what the timeline should be and what the rules should be on that. But I guess to each of you, Chair Castor first, what is the likelihood of passing a clean energy standard, which, as I understand it, would require 60 votes in the Senate?
Well, we have some work to do. I think we have some work to do, and it will depend on what is included in a clean energy standard. In the past, we've had some debate about nuclear power and whether people think that that's going to be a solution. In our report issued last year, we said, yes, nuclear power has to be a part of the equation. And so Representative McKinley and I agree that investments in advanced nuclear will be very important. Coming back to carbon capture, if you can proceed, if you can demonstrate that there is a clear climate benefit to a fuel source, that you're not just using carbon capture and it expands your carbon footprint, I don't think that would be appropriate. And again, we just don't have time to waste. These years of setting targets for 2050, 2040 are just not going to get us to where we need to be. We need to press ahead with the technological evolution in this country and kind of win this global race for competitiveness so that we can then expand jobs and provide everyone a stronger foundation for our economic recovery, and then share those technologies with the rest of the world that would benefit our workers and our companies in America.
Representative McKinley, what is your outlook, again, on passing and getting it through all of Congress, a clean energy standard as you've structured it, or anything else? What's your read on your colleagues on your side of the aisle?
Let me go back to the remark about 2035. To make that transition so that we're net zero on emissions by 2035. I'm going to try to spend time educating people and getting the public more aware of what the cost is going to be. Look at the transitional cost. We've seen several reports. Look at just in Alaska alone, 70% of the revenue to run Alaska comes from fossil fuels. Wyoming is 52% of the revenue to run the state of Wyoming comes from fossil fuels. And in North Dakota, it's 45%. So for us to make this transition by 2035, those respective states, and there are others obviously impacted with it as well, how are they going to make the adjustment to the operating their state what they have it? There have been polls taken about how much more money is the consumer willing to pay when we go to renewable fuels. And it's interesting that Yale, I think that's a fairly well-known school, I suppose. I'm a Purdue graduate, but I accept some things that Yale says. And Yale put out a report that said 50%, when they did polling, 50% of people didn't want to pay anything more on their utility bills. And the other 50% said something less than $200 a year. But the Wood-Mackenzie report that came out last year said, in all likelihood, to get to 2035 with the transition to zero, it's going to cost a household almost $2,000, 10 times as much as the consumer is willing to pay. So the question is going to be, as we approach this, how do we get the consumer willing to recognize the impact or the effect it could have on their health, that it may or may not upset the economy? We've got a lot of education to do if this thing's going to go. So as we speak right now, 2035, I don't think it's realistic. Even Secretary Muniz said just recently that we're not ready. Battery storage, if we're going to do the renewables, that's what we step over to, is renewables. And I'm very supportive of wind, solar, hydro, and the like. But if we're going to switch to that, we've got to have battery storage. And he says it's not feasible now and won't be in a short term. So I don't know where we're going to find out how we're going to address battery storage and the supply chain that's affected with battery storage, because we already know that the main source for our batteries lithium comes from South America. And as your scientists in the crowd here will know, to get 1 ton of lithium out of the ground requires 500,000 gallons of water to be wasted. Water that could otherwise be used for agricultural purposes in South America, in Chile and Argentina, but they're diverting that from that. So we've got a real problem with lithium. Cobalt comes from the Congo, which is under dictatorship. Is that what we want? So we've got some problems on supply chain and how we're going to get the amount of material that we're going to need to have. And one example said that we're going to have 900 gigawatts of battery storage we're going to have if we convert to that. 900 gigawatts of battery storage. But Julia, currently America or the world only has 5.5 gigawatts available total. So go from 5.5 to 900 gigawatts by 2035. It's not realistic. And I think it's going to put a lot of people out of work. So if the Mildred Schmidts of the world, she's my neighbor and your neighbor, when Mildred Schmidt when she's willing to recognize she's going to pay maybe as much as $2,000 to be on reliable, renewable energy, but her neighbor is going to be out of work. I'm not sure where she's going to come down on this.
All right. Well, I hear a lot of that. I think no one would disagree that the challenge in front of us is enormous and the scale would have to be something we have not seen before. I guess the one thing I would add is there's research out of Princeton that came out recently really analyzing how to get to net zero by 2050. So not the power sector by 2035, but extending that timeline. And they did acknowledge a huge mobilization would be necessary. But the cost is actually marginal if you take out what we already spend for energy and you shift it to other lower carbon solutions. You alluded to the just transition, and I want to get to that in a moment. But Chair Castor, any initial thoughts to some of the points that were just brought up there?
Yes, well, the good news is right now, clean energy is a whole lot cheaper than fossil fuels, especially energy efficiency, which we have nowhere near maximized in America. But solar power, wind power, the production costs there are much lower. And plus it's healthier, so you save on public health costs. But here's why that your next door neighbor or the average person on the street doesn't buy it anymore, that this transition is going to cost them money, because we're paying enormous cost because of the climate crisis. Extreme heat, people are paying more on their electric bills because we have additional flooding and storm surges. They're having to lay out more of their property taxes and stormwater fees at home to strengthen their water and wastewater systems. You know, I come from Florida, and we've been battered by these storms that come with greater frequency and greater intensity. And then they come to the Congress, states come to the Congress and ask for billions and billions of dollars in outlays to address catastrophes. Look at the wildfires in the West, flooding in the Midwest. So people understand right now that the cost of inaction much, much higher than the cost of investing in clean energy.
And
I got to jump in on that. Let me follow back up again with that. She's right. But at the same time, that's what we started off on this discussion, Julia. It's a global issue. What we do, if we can't ignore John Kerry's remarks. We can't ignore MIT's remarks. We can't ignore Gina McCarthy's remarks until the rest of the world starts reducing their emissions. They said in committee, even if we do all of this, if the rest of the world continues to emit like they are now, you're still going to have wildfires on the West, droughts in the Midwest, and hurricanes on the East. So all these things are flooding. We're still going to have them until the rest of the world joins with us in reducing their emissions. But I see no intention right now other than just some signing on to some agreements without penalties. Remember, the Paris Accord had no penalties if you violated the agreement. That's why I'm encouraged what John Kerry said. We're going to have to, when we redo the Paris Accord, we're going to have to make it tighter, because we can't allow China, who emits, they burn they're approaching now 5 billion tons of coal annually. India now is going over 1 million tons of coal. So the rest of the world has to capture this. Otherwise, we're still going to pay the price for it in America. So I'm hoping we can get our committee all energized on the same plane, that we've got to find a way to get the rest of the world reducing their CO2 emissions.
Yeah. Chair Castor, how would you do that? What do you think are the tools that the U.S. could employ to get more countries to align with this vision and action?
Well, we have to walk the walk ourselves. I mean, ever since the Industrial Revolution, it's been the United States of America that has benefited due to the use of fossil fuels. We've been the world leader in that, and other countries look at us and say, okay, you have a greater responsibility because of your development over time. And I think folks understand that. Unless we lead in the world, unless we make these investments and lead in the technological changes in the cars we drive, the trucks, the way we produce energy, the rest of the world typically, they're not going to lead in those technological advancements. It's always been the United States of America, the world leader in manufacturing and in science, that has led the way. And I talk to a new generation of young people who are ready to take on that challenge. Experts in science, in public health, in clean energy, they are all committed to doing this, and they know that we can. And now, fortunately, we have Joe Biden, who's come in with a very clear plan on what to do. If folks haven't read it, I suggest you do, but it's create 1 million jobs in the automobile sector through electric vehicles, improving our supply chains and manufacturing. That will go a long way to for a lot of working people across the Midwest, especially, who have seen other industries stagnate over time. That would come along with a lot of investment in training in communities that need to be partnering with our labor unions and with community colleges in training. And again, this is something I hear from a younger generation. They want to be involved. They are inspired. The Biden plan also says aims to create 1 million jobs by retooling our businesses, our buildings, our homes. We can weatherize our homes. We saw this successfully happen after we passed the Recovery Act in 2009. We also think that just in reclaiming coal mines and in other parts of the country working on conservation initiatives, we can help lift local and rural economies and make sure that no one is left behind. And that's why it's exciting this day before the inauguration, the potential we have, especially with America returning to its leadership role in the world.
Congressman McKinley, there's 2 pieces to this. I want to break it out. First is on the international scale. Do you agree that the United States should be investing in the next generation of clean energy technologies to compete and serve these other growing and emerging economies around the world? And so it's worth investing in making that here at home.
Absolutely. And that's what the main content of what our legislation does, is develop that so that we can export that technology to other nations. But we got to drive the price down. Now, back with Congressman Castor said about leadership, I agree. Gina McCarthy said the same thing about leadership. We have to be leadership. Well, leadership in the last 10 years, 15 years, we've already reduced our CO2 emissions by 18%. We've already been leading on showing that. But at the same time, India has increased their CO2 emissions by 250%, and China by 290%. So they're not following our lead. That idea is naive to think that if we do it, they'll follow. They're not. So there's an old line goes out. Julia says, "A man thinks he's a leader and has no followers is just merely a man taking a walk." And I think that's exactly what's happening here. We've been trying to lead, but no one's been following. So I think it's imperative for us to invest significantly in carbon reductions, in the technology to be able to do that. That may mean developing better in hydrogen. It means exploring more in the alum cycle that we can do in something like that is certainly efficiencies can do, but we've got to find a way to develop our batteries in a very short period of time so that we're not relying on other nations. This supply chain, didn't we learn anything from this last pandemic about when we were relying on other nations for supplying material? We've got to find a way to get that material here in the United States, creating American jobs.
Yes. I take your points there. And I would add the one interesting and unfortunate caveat that the local air pollution issues in China and India, just based on my own direct reporting, are really driving a change in tone there because they actually have no option as their populations cope with these horrible smog conditions. So it's been interesting to see the dialogue start to shift, although I agree there's still much more to do. So we talked about creating jobs, and the domestic piece of this is the just transition, how we make sure that communities who are currently in fossil fuels can thrive and succeed, and also communities that have been left behind and struggle with our own domestic air pollution issues and water pollution issues are brought along here too. So first to Chair Castor, what is your proposal to serve communities like Congressman McKinley's and to serve communities in other parts of the country who've been left behind and face the worst effects of climate and pollution issues today?
I think we have to recognize and have a great deal of respect for the energy workers of the past 100 years in America, the coal miners, the folks who've worked in the oil and gas fields. You know, a lot of America's economic success was driven by their hard work and sweat. But now we have a lot of work to do as clean energy and energy efficiency and other new technologies take hold. We have to make sure that no one is left behind. And I have on the Climate Crisis Committee, I have another West Virginian who serves, another and a GOP member from Southwest Virginia. And when I talk with them about what they'd like to see in the future of their communities, they want what everyone else wants. They want good schools. They want good jobs for their family. So I've talked with them a lot about what are those jobs of the future. They talk to me about, not having Washington, D.C. decide what their future is, but having the feds provide some support, be a better partner. They see a lot of potential jobs for reclaiming old mines and turning these into areas where they could attract ecotourism. That will work in some areas. We're going to need a lot of rural America to help us as well with building the macro grid. We have to train new workers and possibly retrain former workers to help us with that very expansive construction initiative where we site these power lines connecting renewable sources to population centers. We hope that this can be combined also with expanding rural broadband. There is a massive deficit of technological tools available to rural areas across America because they do not have Wi-Fi, they don't have broadband, and we see building the macrogrid maybe could go hand in hand with expanding broadband. And that will be critical to helping our farmers. Farmers want to be part of the clean energy economy. They are ready to improve soil health, to rotate their crops, work with their colleges and universities and use the best science. But I've heard directly from farmers that they won't be able to do that unless they have Wi-Fi and they have broadband and can be attuned to the differences in weather and climate over time and fertilizer applications. So those are a few things. I think there are enormous opportunities, and I think now is the time, especially turning the page on that horrendous insurrection at the Capitol. I'm hopeful that Joe Biden is going to speak to everyone's hearts and minds and say it's time for us to be united. It's only through being united and working together that we're going to be able to tackle these enormous challenges ahead. So I'm hopeful.
Recognizing we have 20 minutes or so left, I do want to bring in some questions, and I'd like to introduce another policy that comes up a lot in climate discussions, and that's a price on carbon. I'm going to start domestically, and then we'll bring in a question that refers to it abroad. But Background being that Democrats will control budget reconciliation, so they cannot create new policy through this, but can, adjust spending policy. So one thing that may fit into that framework is a price on carbon. As I understand it, a clean energy standard could not be passed through the budget reconciliation, but something like a carbon price potentially could. So that was not part of Joe Biden's platform, really, a price on carbon, but it is something that historically has bipartisan support. And we've talked about that being important here. So first to Representative McKinley and then Chair Castor, Representative McKinley, would you support a price on carbon? And then Chair Castor, same question to you. Do you think we could see rallying around this?
No, I would not support it because it's avoiding the issue of how we do carbon capture. We've got to put the money into the research and to do this. Look, anyone that advocates wind and solar, they're on the right track, but they have to realize that there are sections of this country that are not available to be able to have wind and solar facilities. We can't replace the coal mine in McDowell County, West Virginia, with wind and solar. If it had been feasible, they would have done it long before now. So what we're doing is relegating them to be, I guess, just cast-offs, collateral damage in this. So I rather than putting another tax on fossil fuels, the carbon emissions, why aren't we investing in finding the ways to capture it? Because already I've seen Congressman Castor deviate some from the fossil fuel, the energy sector, and talk about transportation and infrastructure. All those are good. We're going to have to deal with it. But if we're going to deviate from that, then one of the first things we have to look towards is the steel industry. In the steel industry, China produces almost 1 billion tons. Follow that, 1 billion tons of steel. And for every ton of steel made, you emit almost just short of 2 tons of carbon emissions. So China is going to be emitting 2 billion more tons of CO2 as they continue to make steel. So I'm ready for this next argument when we get to it, but I think today we were trying to stay focused on 2035 and how we're going to address it. I'm going to continue to say I don't think the price on carbon is going to affect what they pay the consumer, and if the consumer is going to bulk over paying anything more than the one report IER came out said maybe they'll go to $16. If they go to $16, that's still $200 a year. But if the cost is $2,000, then we're going to have a rebellion on our hands by Washington forcing something back on the hands of people, and people are going to lose their jobs. So I think we've got a real problem in how we're going to address it. I hope we do it through innovation.
Representative Castor.
Last year, when the Climate Crisis Committee in the Congress developed its over 500-page roadmap action plan that covered every sector of the economy and made recommendations on resilience and adaptation as well, it was based upon very broad outreach to scientists, to engineers, to stakeholders, farmers, activists, and we took all of those, we took hundreds of requests for information on recommendations on what policies we should enact to meet our climate goals. And after hearing from experts and stakeholders across that ran the gamut, we said, well, a price on carbon is one tool in the toolbox, but it is not a silver bullet. So we recommend that the Congress has a bit more work to do when it comes to any price on carbon. Is it going to be a carbon tax like many businesses advocate for, or would it be going back to a cap and trade system? We say, well, you have to look around the United States of America. There are some trading cap and trade initiatives that have begun in the mid-Atlantic, and then California with Canada. Is it smart for the U.S. to come in and upset those right now? So we have more work to do, but it has not been the focus of conversations to date. I think moving forward, we're really going to be looking for bipartisan solutions here in the near term to move us as quickly as we need to get, as quickly as we need to go.
A specific question from Megan Shipman is, would the members support a carbon border adjustment tax as a tool to sway other countries toward low carbon initiatives? We've talked about the international space here. So a carbon border adjustment tax, Representative McKinley, is that at all aligned with your views?
I'm not familiar with the term. I've thought all along that we wound up using trade as a vehicle to get the other nations to abide by it. But you have to understand, I had an opportunity to meet with Prime Minister Modi in India, and he told me that he's got 1.2 billion people living in India, and his emissions are horrid. They don't capture the SOx and NOx gases. They don't have cooling towers to reduce their emissions into the aquatic life. So he said, even with that, as cheaply as we're making electricity now, he said 300 million people in India don't have electricity. He said, so if we were to adopt your plans as to what the strategy is now to do carbon emissions, he said, we might wind up going to 600 million people without electricity. So we've got to develop something that is affordable for him to implement so that he does not go to 600 million people in India without power, without electricity. So whether it's trade, whether it's technology, whatever that is, I don't know the border aspect of it, but I do understand how trade could be used as a tool.
I just want to jump in only because I just finished this series on India. What I did find interesting is just in the mid of the pandemic, they announced that 29 coal plants will be replaced by renewables. They had a series of 3 record low solar prices in India. So that was just interesting to see. I think they're kind of building the airplane as they go here and understanding that their strategy may need to shift. But Chair Castor, comments from you on the carbon border adjustment, if you're familiar?
Yes, it's interesting that it hasn't been part of the dialogue by policymakers here in the U.S., probably because we would be caught up in it, and it may be an impediment upon a lot of our goods and the way that we produce them here in America. So we do have to be mindful of that. But for those big emitters that carry such a huge responsibility right now in China and India, I think this will be something that we will look at. And I bet, based upon what my colleague Rep. McKinley has said today about the role of international players, he's probably going to be quite supportive of it moving forward.
And so getting a little nuanced here, transmission, that is a big issue. We hear about infrastructure as constantly being a Democrat and a Republican priority, but it's hard to get these bills through at the end of the day. And transmission in particular, which facilitates the expansion of clean energy solutions, is hard to pass. It's hard to get approved even at local levels through red tape because of red tape and local concerns. So is that something that's a priority for either of you, building out the transmission and smart grid? And how would you go about doing it so we can actually see some movement? Chair Castor, then Representative McKinley.
You're right, Julia. This is a critical piece. And fortunately, now coming into the executive branch, we're going to have some very knowledgeable expert folks who are going to help us create this path, because this is the key to creating millions of jobs in America. And making sure that we're working together with labor unions and scientists, and especially those communities that really need a better economic base. This is going to be an enormous opportunity for them. But there are impediments to how you plan for these large transmission lines, how they're paid for, and how they're sited. In our climate crisis action plan, we recommend doing a lot of work on the front end, so you don't end up with a tangle with legal issues at the end, but citing early some corridors that make sense environmentally and economically, working with state and local folks to make sure we don't, that everyone agrees on it. And I think if folks understand that these investments up front will save us a lot of money down the road, that they are going to be quite interested in doing it. But you've hit upon it, it's going to be quite challenging. But it provides an enormous opportunity.
Rep. McKinley, thoughts?
And I would agree with that. I think she's on top. That the siting is going to be the issue. We're seeing environmentalists fighting pipelines all across America. And then the issue we remember back in the 70s and 80s, the big idea was high tension lines, power lines. They didn't want it in their backyard because they thought it caused cancer. So I think you're going to see more and more environmental activists get engaged in that. But I want to go back, Julie, to your comment a little bit about India. Yes, they're transitioning away from a fuel source in India that they use now called lignite. Lignite only produces, has about 3,000 to 4,000 BTUs in its production for heat rate. So they have to use a lot of coal to provide electricity. So what they've done is they've increased their buy from a mine in Australia, the Carmichael mine. It's an Adani mine there, so that they can get coal from Australia to replace the lignite with bituminous coal that will have anywhere from 12 to 13,000 BTU. So they'll be using less coal on that, but they're still going to be using coal. So they're still focused on using coal. They just want to. Their existing lignite power plants cannot burn bituminous coal. It's too hot for the pipes to be able to handle in the boiler system. So rather than, they've just retired those and are building new coal-fired power plants using the bituminous coal from Carmichael mine.
Take that point. Another question from our audience, just as I try to run through these in our final minutes here, is shifting to nuclear power. It was referenced in passing, but to what extent do you think we could see bipartisan support of advanced nuclear and maybe even keeping existing nuclear plants open? Representative McKinley, go to you first.
Well, I can't agree more. We don't have nuclear in West Virginia, but it's all over the country. When I came to Congress, there were about 106 power plants. Now it's down to just in the 90s because they've been decommissioned. The problem has been in getting support from the Democrats for the disposal of spent fuel rods in Yucca Mountain. John Shimkus out of Illinois fought for 12, 15 years to try to find that. We have to have a solution to what we're going to do with spent fuel rods, and they can't be left sitting around where they become a danger to other folks that could get those. So I'm very much supportive of it. It's part of our innovate first, regulate later is the idea of nuclear, but we've got to find a way to dispose of the spent fuel rods.
Chair Castor?
Disposal is one issue, and I think the recognizing that nuclear power is a carbon-free source, it is a very important piece of our getting to net zero over time. And the Democrats strongly believe in R&D for advanced nuclear as well. One of the issues with the existing nuclear plants is going to be safety, because if we're going to look at extending their licenses, it cannot be done without investments in the safety protocols, in the folks who will inspect those plants. If they are safe and secure and their licenses can be extended for a certain amount of time, then that will be appropriate and that will be a good carbon-free fuel source. But for new plants, it's going to be very difficult for them to compete on cost. For example, in my neck of the woods in Florida, we had one utility who was aiming to construct a new nuclear power plant. They did the cost and benefits, and it just the enormous cost of it just put it out of reach. The same utility was looking to extend the life of an existing nuclear plant, went in there and did repairs themselves and broke the plant. And here's what really upsets ratepayers. This utility asked ratepayers to pay in advance for not just the new nuclear plant, but for repairs of the old plant. They ended up with not 1 kilowatt hour, an enormous cost having to be carried by ratepayers in advance. And that wasn't fair. That's why they believe those investments are better made in clean energy technologies, in solar, especially in the Sunshine State in Florida, and in energy efficiency, where our state has not placed much emphasis at all.
So we have under 5 minutes remaining. And so, Chair Castor, I'd like to stick with you just to close this out. Since Democrats do have a majority, can you give us specifics? What are you watching for next? What's the next hearing coming up? Are you looking for confirmations of, in the administration? Is it the budget reconciliation? What are the top bullet points that we should be watching for?
Thanks, Julia. Well, here we are, the day before the inauguration of Joe Biden. We understand that he has put together an expert team when it comes to clean energy policy, and that he has some very ambitious goals. So now it's incumbent upon the Congress to work together in a bipartisan way to help implement that plan. We're going to have great debate between Democrats and Republicans, rural members, urban members. But a lot of it is going to come down to what the public presses us to do. The public will determine how ambitious we are. I see a growing consensus across America, businesses, activists, students, farmers, and they want us to reach for the stars. They want us to be ambitious and help create a new foundation in America, good paying jobs based on clean energy and environmental justice.
We do have 3 minutes left. Representative McKinley, if you could just put it in 3 bullet points, I'll have to jump in if we go over, but what should we look out on your side?
Well,
actual actions.
I think the first, Julie, we got to get back to civility. That's been lost in the last maybe 3-4 years. We've lost civility with it. I think we have to work together, but it's got to be in a way in bipartisan fashion. We called for bipartisan, didn't get support. Representative Castor, she's right. She's calling for bipartisan, but it's when we called for it, it was said, yeah, only because you want to do it your way and not our way. So it's going to be, what do you mean by bipartisan if it has that support? And the third thing I think that most important is that we're going to have to get the American public to understand that it makes no difference what America does in reducing its carbon emissions, that until the rest of the world attacks this, we're still going to have wildfires on the West Coast, droughts in the Midwest, and hurricanes. It is a global problem. We all have to come together to fight this. And there's no point in decimating our economy in the United States, because if the rest of the world hasn't followed suit. So those would be the 3 things. Thank you. And thank you for your audience and the chance for us to all chat here together. I look forward to a different administration, how we're all going to work together, because we've got to do something for this country.
Well, in that spirit, what I heard today is, there's incredible challenges and mobilization that would need to happen. We need to be cognizant of consumer pocketbooks and bringing people along. But there is some unity, at least in this conversation, around a clean energy standard. But we'll have to depend on the year and how it's imposed and what technologies could be involved. There is a role for carbon capture sequestration, which sounds like it has bipartisan support, less so for a price on carbon, but a unified view that the U.S. needs to engage with the rest of the world in engaging on climate. Of course, the devil's in the details of all of these things, but we'll end on a positive note there of highlighting the commonalities. So thanks so much to both members for this great discussion. And thanks to everyone who's listening. I'm going to pass it over now to Global Energy Center Director Randy Bell as he leads us into our next segment. So over to you, Randy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Julia and Representatives Castor and McKinley. What a remarkable conversation. Now more than ever, it's heartening to see a serious, thoughtful, bipartisan discussion about climate action.